Welcome back to Three Men in a Boat. There is no shortage of things for us to discuss. In fact, we could probably sit 12 hours a day every day and still not cover everything that's going on. Specifically, though, since the last time we spoke, Russia seems to have been pushed out of Syria. Economic stats seem to show that the Russian economy is in a dire state. But will that change anything? Will that dissuade Putin from executing his war? Will it indeed have an impact on his war machine? That is certainly questionable. And we're also going to look at how the rout of Russian forces in Syria may affect Putin's other global ventures, his other adventures around the world, including in sub-Saharan Africa, to try and scrape together resources, cash, and keep that authoritarian mafia-run business model going. I'm delighted to be joined by Axel and Jason again as regular guests on this format. And we're going to probably range all sorts of sort of dark corners of the news, but these are the core topics we're going to be discussing today. Gentlemen, welcome.
Good to see you.
Likewise.
Well, let's start on this. I mean, Syria, it's happened, it's big, it's huge news, but already the news cycle is moving on. What should we learn from what's happened in Syria? What should perhaps we understand from this that we would not necessarily read about in the news headlines? Let's start with Jason.
So I think that it's obviously the fall of the Assad regime will affect Russia directly, right? We see that with the loss of the military bases as well as the naval base, which, keep in mind, they've had a naval base there since 1972. They've had new agreements over the years, but still it's significant. And it's not just about projecting strength throughout the Mediterranean, but also throughout Africa. Remember, in the past couple of years, Russia's backed coups in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. And there is currently Wagner-like groups now called Africa Corps located there that are helping to extract minerals. Essentially, it's enslaving the local population, abusing the local population, and taking as much natural resources as they can. But in those countries, even, we see that there's significant problems. We see that there's already problems. And they're only going to get worse. Now that Russia cannot project strength, now that Russia cannot even send more troops, send more supplies there, there's no easy way for them to help out their troops or their men on the ground there. And it goes further, is that Russia also has interest through, for instance, the CAR and other parts of Africa. These are all going to be sort of off limits if Russia cannot reach a new agreement with the new Syrian government. And there's another factor, which I don't think we talk about enough, which is the economic factor. So aside from the natural resources and the other illegal activities that they engage in, the Syrian regime itself, aside from the kleptocracy, was into the narcotics. They sold a drug that's very common in the Middle East and other parts that's used as similar to methamphetamine, a little bit different, but it was produced, the largest producer in the world, in fact, was the Syrian government. And you'd ask, why is the Syrian government producing narcotics? Well, for the exact same reason that the Venezuelan government trades in narcotics. Maduro himself, the president or dictator of Venezuela, is considered to be the top narco kingpin in the world. He's got a $20 million bounty on him by the FBI. So you think, well, Syria, Venezuela, strange. What's the connection? There's another connection too. Between those two countries, the ones that does the most business, or one of the top ones, I should say, is Hezbollah. Hezbollah is an organization, terrorist organization, backed by Iran. And you say, well, what does Hezbollah, Venezuela, and Syria have in common? And where's Russia fit into this? Well, in fact, these are all being backed by Russia. And one of the reasons that they're being backed is that as sanctioned countries, as well as sanctioned organizations, they have to cooperate with each other. They don't have a larger market. They can't go find out a bank that's willing to give them a loan or transfer money. So they have to wash the money. So washing money that's brought in through narcotics, for instance, drug cartels in Latin America have a huge amount of cash, but they can't access banks. But there's a very good deal that they can make, which is transfer using banks in countries such as Russia in exchange for cash. And being able to trade with also cryptocurrencies become popular too. But neither here nor there, the relationship between all these different organizations is that they play a role in the global drug cartels, weapons trafficking, human trafficking, and other forms of illegal behavior. But Syria was actually a very important part of that global operation. And now that it's been lost, that upsets the trade. And now that Hezbollah has been destroyed or largely degraded, it's going to make it even harder. So this means not just that other terrorist organizations will have problems. This means that even the Russian state, which was dependent on that cash and that liquidity, are going to have harder and harder times of being able to keep it together. So I think it's actually going to be something that we will see the effects of in the next few weeks as the Russian troops located in different African countries are no longer resupplied. as Russia doesn't get the infusion of cash that it was expecting, its banks are not being used for the money laundering that it had expected, it will affect their economy overall as well. So I think in the few weeks ahead, we should be seeing big results. But what do you think, Jonathan?
Yeah, I think this is going to have a whole series of knock-on effects. And without being an expert on that trade, I can certainly see, this is a key question. Yes, Russia wants to, it sees itself as the world leader of authoritarianism. It sees that mode of governance as the only right and moral and proper thing to actually exert. They probably don't believe in organic democracy. Anyway, they just think we behave like that, but we're all pretending. So that's the first thing. Yes, there's this global effort to try to undermine and destroy democracy and the institutions that have been built to try and create resilience that underpin rule of law around the world. But as you say, it's also the business model. I think we always look at the politics and we forget that actually what Russia is defending is a business model. When you look at the kind of dissidents that they've taken out, when you look at the people they've actually expended real hard cash on killing, assassinating, it's usually people that are involved in business deals or threaten their business model. Litvinenko, again, we focus on political, but one of the main reasons they took him out, yes, he's a traitor to the KGB, but he was threatening many of their ventures. He was threatening their business model. It's why Bill Browder, I think, is probably one of the most at-risk people in the world, because he's directly affected, the way they generate their cash. Whereas others who tackle the regime, or from a political standpoint and so on, in the grand scheme of things, they don't see these as being particularly effective or a direct threat to their business model. So looking at authoritarians, following the money, that seems to me to be absolutely critical here. The question that I bounce back to you, Jason, then, is that what we see is the Wagner Group operations in Africa. Of course, China has numerous interests there, but the Wagner Group and their activities in sub-Saharan Africa are very much related to various business models, either providing security for particularly nasty regimes. We see there's no compunction there. In fact, the nastier the regime, the easier and more attractive perhaps it is for the Kremlin to deal with them, because they recognize in that people who are ready to take action and have no moral compunction whatsoever in order to do that. But you have a whole range of minerals, precious metals, various other things. It's rumored uranium maybe play a role in some of these places. So what is going to be the knock-on effect of Russia potentially permanently losing its bases in Latakia and Tartus?
So I think that the loss will be, it's really going to be sort of interesting to see what the local reaction is going to be. As we usually do talk about the general geopolitics, the fact that Russia's allies see this as being a sign they can no longer trust Moscow, or depend on Moscow, I should say, that they see that there's inherent weakness. And Putin's blown it really big recently with that. Not just the invasion of Ukraine, which turned out disastrously bad for him, just simply not being able to take over a country, which, given the size of the Russian military, should really they were totally unprepared. They had no idea what they were doing. And it's a mess. Russia cannot execute a war and win in Ukraine. Certainly, how's it going to back the major countries of the world? What really does it provide its allies? It doesn't provide much, because when push comes to shove, they can't do much, as we saw in the case of Assad. We saw in the case, and by the way, it's not the first time. Even in 2010, you probably remember that there's a revolution in Kyrgyzstan. And shortly thereafter, there was a series of events called the Osh events, which was in Jalalabad in Osh region, southern part of the country, where there's ethnic cleansing that broke out, significant ethnic cleansing between Kyrgyz and Uzbeks. And the president of Kyrgyzstan went on TV, Rosa Atambayeva, first female president in Central Asian history, and she said she asked the Russians to intervene, send troops to try to calm the situation. Now, the Russians have a military base in Kant, Kyrgyzstan, and the Russians refused to intervene, which is sort of fascinating to me. So here's Kyrgyzstan, a country that's extremely tight with Russia. 29% of its GDP is remittances, in addition to the fact that actually, we did opinion polling there one time, this is 15 years ago, and we asked, what do you think of various foreign leaders? And the approval rating of Vladimir Putin was 98%, and the approval rating of Dmitry Medvedev was 99%. So extremely pro-Russian viewpoints in the country. And yet, the Russians refused to intervene. And I think it's for two reasons. One, because they just try to take advantage of the local population, the Kyrgyz, to use them as workers in their construction, things like that. But they're not actually interested in the people of Kyrgyzstan or the country of Kyrgyzstan. They just want to extract from them, in this case, people as well as natural resources. And so I think it's the same thing when we look at Africa. Russia is not interested inherently in these countries. It has no interest in spreading a global ideology. It's not like the Soviet Union. They had a clear goal. Rather, it's a business model. It's a mafia. So it shows up in various countries and makes more and more money. And it's a topic you and I have discussed before, Jonathan, is that, and David Satter's written a lot about, is the fact that Vladimir Putin's own background is a mafia boss. You know, he was a guy in St. Petersburg who used to be collecting bribes for Sobchak, who was the mayor of St. Petersburg after independence. And he rose up the ranks, and he was able to be a happy middleman between both the criminal gangs with whom he was interacting and taking bribes from, and the KGB, then which then became the FSB, which he had served in for years and became a colonel. So he was the guy who was able to merge those two and say, listen, we have a network of global intelligence service. We have airplanes, vehicles, everything that's necessary. And we can find your opponents and help kill them. But we will help you to expand your illegal operations beyond Russia to the globe. And they did. And since then, 30 years now, it has become a global enterprise. And they're interlinked with a lot of different mafias, as we know, that do spread to every country in the world, including the United States and Europe. And I think it's fascinating. But it also shows you that Russia has a different motive than the one that we often talk about, which is just geopolitics. I agree with you totally, Jonathan. I absolutely agree with you. It's as much as that is interesting, and I enjoy talking about it a lot. I realize, though, it's unfortunately, I think, even more simplistic. It's about money, and it's about preserving the regimes. Because really, the only thing a dictator really cares about, and I came to realize is the reason that oligarchs collect more money. You think, he's got 20 billion. Why are they still going for so much money? It's so cutthroat. And it's a simple reason, is that when a war actually starts between them and they start to kill each other, the guy who's got more money can afford more soldiers and afford more weaponry and afford more ability to defend himself. So it's building up a war chest, quite literally, for future battles. And they think of it as a global scale. I mean, it could be against a country. We just saw in the country of Moldova, the elections that they tried to fix using a local Moldovan oligarch. It was actually being financed by Abramovich, which is one of the large Russian oligarchs, as you all know, who used to own a soccer team in the UK. But he was the one financing this. So these oligarchs are proxies of the Russian state. And we see the same thing, by the way, in Georgia. Ivanishvili, the pro-Russian leader who just won the elections, or his party did, Georgian Dream. Well, what's going on there? The guy's made billions of dollars in Russia. So he has ties there. But it's a global network of business partners who work together, they're allies. And countries are simply the vehicle that they use in order to achieve widespread availability to other markets. But where do you see it going from here? Do you think it's going to get better, worse, indifferent for Russia? What is on the horizon for Russia next?
I think this is the key question, because whereas, a lot of people who back in 2022 were saying, Russians won't put up with this, there's going to be a revolution, etc. Well, you and I know that was never going to happen. That was never going to reach a critical mass. There seems to be the sort of goldfish effect where we're now thinking, hang on a sec, the Russian economy is on the verge of collapsing. Yes, the Russian market economy and the economy that's been built, the economic structures that have been built since the 90s, and really, that process that really kicked in from 98 after their sovereign debt default, all that architecture of so-called liberal economics. If that system was to collapse in a true market democracy, then yes, everybody out on the streets, it would be pandemonium and chaos. And in fact, we're still feeling, I think, the effects of the 2008 financial crisis working their way through the culture even now. It's a process. That energy, that frustration has to go somewhere. Russia does not behave like this. So yes, the market economy may well implode. There may well be considerable pain for individuals throughout Russia. Will that lead to some kind of political transformation? Absolutely not, because none of the instruments there, none of the culture is there, none of the organization is there. But what you do have, as you've pointed out, is one of the most effective sort of police states in history, and one of the best set of people to manipulate information and use this sort of psychological coercion on their own population. So those who are thinking that Russian economic collapse in a market sense is going to lead to an end of the war, I think need to think again. We need to double down. Yes, we need to ensure that the economy doesn't get the oxygen it needs, but we also need to prepare, I think, to give Ukraine everything it needs in terms of weapons, because this fight is not going to end just because we win some battles in the economic war. Even then, on the horizon, we have the possibility that Trump does not see the point of sanctions. So rather than tightening the noose around Russia's economic neck, we may well see that loosening instead. So I'm not particularly optimistic here. The loss of Syria is a huge blow, but it is a potential temporary setback on one of many, many fronts in which Russia operates. But what it doesn't have, and what wasn't able to push back against this mafia structure, but Ukraine was, and Georgia is trying to do that at the moment, it has a population, not a citizenry. It does not have anybody who can organize to confront it and roll back, not just oligarchy, because I'm not even sure Russia has an oligarchy anymore. As you say, everything's an extension of the state, of the Leviathan, as Sergei Medvedev has called it in his book. So I don't think any of that will change. Putin will carry on cranking that system, and with the aggression and with the sort of desperation, with all the things we've seen. The question more to me is, will the West organize to push back against that in a way that we have not seen in the last 3 years?
So Jonathan,
that the West would need to have a perception and understanding, comprehensive understanding in the population. Currently, that is not the case. We three here may easily, and I was listening to this, and I tend to agree with the arguments made and the facts presented. But if you think about it, who in the West does? Not even Monsieur Macron, who supposedly now gave Mr. Ivanishvili a hard time in an hour-long phone call, was able to then, in a press conference afterwards, to explain to the French press what he had done, because he also likes to keep his diplomacy and his strategies rather secret. For good measure, for good reason, don't get me wrong, but at the same time, he is not talking to the population at the moment because he has completely different other problems. So we're not talking to the population. Our politicians are not even versed in Europe. Sorry, not making comment on the Americans, but in Europe, the politicians are not versed in taking action, and they are not versed in communicating about what needs doing. And as such, the population is not even aware or doesn't have a sense of this. They live in a Goldilocks information environment where they still believe that they're apples and apples, that Russia is just another state, maybe a little bit more authoritarian, but still a state. Whereas you just both described what we know, that it's not. That it's essentially a population owned by a small elite, highly organized and the likes. You could argue whether the Chinese are doing this more effectively in a different fashion maybe, but still, that being the case, they don't perceive the risk. They are afraid of risks, but they are afraid of risks which actually do not really matter. They're afraid of what Putin portrays as a risk, meaning that somebody would use a nuclear weapon. Completely irrelevant. It's not happening. Many, many good reasons why not. But they're afraid of that. Afraid of the asymmetric warfare and the infiltration.
It's in my view, it's a failed state and a failed country in both senses, and has been for a number of years. And that's not my idea. I think there are a few individuals, David Satter included, who have been saying this for some considerable time, but we do not, as you say, Axel, grasp that. China is neither a failed state nor a failed country, and it's got a well-advanced bureaucracy for all of the authoritarian tendencies. It's a machine that is highly effective, and it has long-term strategy and the ability to execute on that. But I think, if we make presumptions about what Russia is and isn't, there is a tendency to project our own framework, our own understanding, our own culture onto it. None of these are reliable guides. Our compasses will not work in that space.
I question, though, whether or not the Russian economy's collapse wouldn't affect other things. And the reason I say that is because there's a few different bubbles it's dealing with. And when you look at the size, the degree that it's the size of the bubbles that it has, it's approaching 30% of the country's economy. So if that were to fall, now let's look at short term. Let's look at even the bubbles not busting. Let's look at just hard data that we know and we don't have to guess or estimate. So we know that the value of the ruble, it has about a 28% inflation rate according to Dr. Hankey at Johns Hopkins University. But in addition to that, we know that the Russian ruble, if the oil prices go down, as anticipated starting in a few months, that if every dollar that the oil prices go below $72 per barrel, starts to create deficits in the Russian national budget. Why is that? Well, national budget's calculated at $72 per barrel. So let's imagine the oil prices go down to what they're estimating it will go down to. Even though OPEC Plus is not going to cut prices or try to drive up production, which would cut down the cost or the price of oil, we've seen that the U.S. is going to, and Venezuela is likely to as well. The result of that is going to be oil prices will go down. And it's been estimated they might go to about $50 per barrel. So if that were to happen, the ruble would have to be devalued. So how much? So the general estimate is that it would have to be devalued to about 135 to 155 to the dollar. Now, think about this. If you have 25 to 35% devaluation on one side, 28% inflation on the other side, that's eating up a lot of people's money. And more than that, the average Russian spends more than 50% of their money on food. But Russians in major cities like Moscow, spend it on mortgages. So where it gets really complicated, those banks that gave out mortgages to people a ways back at very, very low interest rates, remember only a year ago, the interest rate in Russia was 8%. If they were to give out loans to people and say, listen, now we're going to have to be charging you, let's say 35%, 55%, 65%. And actually this morning I just read a headline saying that the actual percent rate for mortgages now in Russia in real terms is about 100%. But let's imagine that people have already taken out the loans that can no longer afford them. Their salaries are sticky. They have not increased to commiserate with the degree of devaluation or inflation. And once they start to just go bankrupt and not able to repay their loans and walk away from their houses, we're not talking about a few people. I mean, for any bank to collapse, you don't need a huge percentage of people to default. It's a pretty small percentage you need in order to start breaking down banks. But imagine you just had a certain percentage of them start to default. Where that gets really interesting, a lot of people believe, myself included, is that the Russian government is using the banks, because a lot of the banks are government connected. They're using those banks for money that they use for the military. But if those banks go bust, it means they would have to, one, be bailed out by the government, which means printing more money, but which the government certainly cannot afford. Just VTB Bank, which today is showing that they are taking money, they're not giving people the derivatives. And the reason is because they said they have to reinvest it. The real reason is they have a lack of liquidity. If VTB Bank flipped over and died, that's about a 2 trillion ruble buyout. Keep in mind, it's currently about 100 rubles to dollar. So 2 trillion, that's a lot of dough to buy out VTB Bank. Now imagine if this were to happen to a few different banks at the same time. At that point, you do get to a stage where it could be something that is actually hyperinflation. But let's go to something that's a secondary effect that I think a lot of people are hoping we'll see, and I think it's really realistic, is that when you start to pay people something that's devalued, before the Russians were contracting soldiers, they're getting paid $2,000 a month after the initial sign-on bonus of another $20,000. But let's imagine you're serving, and no longer are you receiving the ruble equivalent of $2,000. You're receiving the ruble equivalent of $400. Is it worth sticking around and dying for that? And I think the answer is no. And history has shown that when economies collapse, militaries, one, stop getting supplies, which causes a lot of problems, especially desertion. And when your salaries disappear, that causes a lot more desertions. And so I think that there's more and more problems that Russia is going to have to keep it all together. But ultimately, Putin himself, I fully agree with Jonathan. I have no expectation there'll be a red revolution or people in the streets clamoring for democracy. Unfortunately, it's not the fate of Russia, I believe. But I think it is much more probable, though, is something a little bit different. Is that if you're an oligarch around Putin and you're smart, which they are smart, if you actually look at the background of Russian oligarchs and Russian mafia leaders, there's something sort of interesting. Look at the number of them, when you read their biographies on Wikipedia, for instance, that have degrees in physics. It is a well disproportionate number, the number of physicists I've ever known in my life. So you think, why is this club filled with physicists and chess players? And you realize they're smart. They're unusually high IQ individuals. But you're sitting there calculating the situation. You realize that Putin, main reason, I believe, he's been able to stay in power for 25 years, is unlike the 1990s when Russia was extremely violent, and it's still very violent, but not like the 1990s, where there was hundreds of murders in Moscow between business people and the mafia. That doesn't really happen in Russia anymore. And the reason is that Vladimir Putin has become the linchpin. He is the cornerstone upon which the mafia is built. So he balances out everybody. Nobody goes against him. And he makes sure that the mafias don't kill each other. They're not allowed to kill each other because he protects all different factions. Now, when that linchpin goes, that is Putin dies, the larger mafias will destroy the smaller mafias. The big factions will destroy the little factions. And if you know that you're in the little faction and you know that you're hated by the big faction, you can be absolutely certain when they take power after Putin, they're going to come and kill you and your family and take your assets. And that's why people always joke about why, Russian bankers are going through windows all the time. And it's a very simple reason, is that they had information that was dangerous to the business interests of others. They'd been fired or were going to be replaced, or somebody else was hired. And they had too much knowledge. They had to get killed. So if you have this sort of mentality and you look at Vladimir Putin, who's 72 years old, any day he could kick the bucket. I mean, when it happens doesn't really matter. What matters is it will happen. Are you going to leave to chance what will happen to you and your family if they get killed after the other faction comes to power following Putin's death? Or is it better to take this into your own hands and kill Putin yourself, which then would position you to become the world's richest man? But it goes even further, is that if you look at this paradigm and you say, okay, game theory would argue that you should operate in your own interest and defend yourself in your own economic interest and eliminate the competition. But if we take it a little bit further, so why would the war in Ukraine end? So aside from the military collapsing, if you are somebody who overthrows a government, the most dangerous phase of any revolutionary action is called the counter-revolutionary phase, which is immediately after. Those who say, who are you to take power? What legitimacy do you have? And historically, the best way to protect yourself when that happens, because it will happen, is aside from colluding with the intelligence service and the military, you definitely need one of those to have a successful revolution nowadays, but both is even better. But there's still going to be factions that don't want to correlate with you, don't want to work with you. And now that Putin's allowed so many of the oligarchs to create their own private military companies, though they call them something else now, there's going to be a high risk that you may be overthrown. So what should you do? You should bring the military back to Moscow, because the best thing you could do is protect yourself. And there's no oligarch nor president of Russia who cares about anything more than their own security. That is always going to be the first place. And even the money, even for Putin, far more important than money, is protecting his own hide, to make sure that he doesn't get lynched and to make sure he doesn't get overthrown. That is his top number one priority, as it was for every other dictator, whether it was Assad, whether it was Gaddafi, they're all the same. And so if that's the case, it's not about money, it's about protecting one's own self-preservation. I would argue that a significant financial decline or rapid collapse of the Russian economy, hyperinflation or something like that, could have effects that we cannot yet anticipate. And judging by what we saw when Prigozhin of Wagner Group went to Rostov, do you remember how the people greeted him? It's positively. We didn't see people linking arms to defend Rostov. They greeted him. They brought him wine. They brought him food. When we saw the Kursk incursion by the Ukrainians, we didn't see the local Russians show up and say, give us arms, we'll go defend our motherland. No, they fled. They didn't do anything. The Russians who I spoke to when I went to Kursk, Russia, were extremely negative about Putin. And they didn't hate the Ukrainians. They weren't scared of them either. These are all signs, little signs, but signs. The population will not stand up to defend Putin. So if you're somebody trying to ascertain the moment that's correct to overthrow the government, you should choose the moment when the government's, one, the weakest, but two, there's the least amount of chance of a counter-revolution that works against you. And that would be precisely when the economy collapses. But what do you guys think?
100% agree with that. Again, it's not a population. It's not people who are from an ideological point of view or from any kind of national identity. They're not going to defend anything. As long as whoever rules over them allows them to, they get their stipend, they've got some sausage and beer in the fridge and whatever, they're allowed to continue with their privileges and their perks. Nobody is going to argue with that. And I think even though many of these oligarchs, some of them will be well-versed in Russian history, some will have a more anecdotal view of it, they will have all heard of Alexander Kerensky, probably one of the bitterest men in history, who for a few short months could have prevented the Bolshevik Revolution. And he didn't, because he continued the First World War. He realized that Russia had overreached. He did nothing to end that overreach. I think in this sense, Putin has overreached militarily. He has reduced Russia's resources. He's reduced Russia's ability to defend its allies or pump resources into allies like Assad. I think there's a number of things we need to do. There's several levers that need to be pulled. And the outcome will not be a popular revolution, but it will be some form of coup or mutiny. And it will not result in nuclear chaos. Unfortunately, when you speak to many journalists and analysts, the coercive manipulation of nuclear weapons has got inside all of their heads. All of them. They are allergic to talking about the idea of regime change. They are allergic to talk about the idea of doing anything that will force Russia to collapse. They say, yes, Ukraine must win, but they do not say Russia must lose, and they do not articulate how that should happen, and they certainly don't take any action to make it happen. They've got inside our heads, and that's all I can say about that.
Yeah, because the politicians of today have not identified the other side towards their electorates as the enemy, their adversary. That's the key issue.
Or to themselves, not just the electorate. I'm not sure they've even identified to themselves that this is the enemy.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree. Obviously, some of them are so weak-kneed and mealy-mouthed and, shall we say, intellectually disenchantingly mediocre, that they are incapable of seeing the reality. They live in Alice in Wonderland politics. And fortunately, this works actually as an image because Russia is the Wizard of Oz. China is much more threatening. I agree with many people who refer to that. It's much more threatening because they're very well organized and they have a very large body of people who support the policies and the regime of the Chinese Communist Party. Russia is hollow. The German it's a state of Tönen and Füßen. It stands on feet which actually have very, very thin legs. And what would happen, by the way, when you speak about the collapse all the time, or the potential impending collapse, that would have to be in a liquidity crisis. What you could see in the 1990s is that no purchasing power, no liquidity, the pensioners had no money and they couldn't buy anything and they couldn't even sustain themselves. If you were to accelerate a liquidity crisis by depriving them of oil and gas revenues for a little while and making them spend even more of their precious war chest liquidity very quickly, that would send shivers down their spine. And this gloom and doom needs to unfold in their elite so that they cannot live as... Currently, they're very comfy. They know that the West is heterogeneous, that it's not well organized. There is no supreme allied command, shall we say, to work against them. The coalition doesn't have one general coordinating matters. I mean, if you were to by the way, the NATO exists for this. You should literally call it what it is. This is a war against freedom and the West. The last time this happened and this occurred, there was a NATO general handling it. Oh, sorry, the preceding general. Somebody named Eisenhower the Supreme Allied Commander. You need to have this. You need to have unity of command in the West. We don't have it. You can't give this to, as Mr. Trump is now highlighting, to the Europeans. That's impossible. The Europeans have no political... They have no agreed approach, strategy, consensus, nothing. They're all looking for American leadership. Well, the American leadership doesn't want to lead, evidently. So Putin is very comfy, very happy at the moment. So we have to be lucky that their own weakness leads them to making wrong decisions, like in Syria, starting a war in Ukraine in the way as they did, which then renders only the Ukrainians the ones who can actually affect this. Which is why the refinery bombing campaign is so effective, which is why it's so important. And if the Ukrainians were to actually target a few more of those oil tankers and forget about Greenpeace, that would probably help.
I've talked to a number of people about this, and it seems there are some details of not just international, not just will to act, but also international law that prevent Western allies working against, say, the Grey Fleet and so on. So I can see there are noises being made, but I don't expect to see a huge amount of progress on that. But if we come back to Russian collapse, I totally agree that the likelihood is that whoever takes over is going to face a period of challenge to their authority. It took Putin how many years? It took him a good number of years to actually take control of the instruments of state, the media, and turn it from a quasi-free media into a propagandistic media. This takes a number of years to entrench that authority. We also remember that if, as David Satter says, Yuri Feschtinsky and others, that the apartment bombings in Moscow were part of a psychological campaign to cement Putin's authority and popularity, and then give him the excuse to go into Chechnya for a second time. This is an awful lot of planning and investment in building the authority of a future tyrant or hybrid autocracy, whatever it is. Whoever's taking over from Putin will not have time to build that personal cachet, especially if it's not someone who is part of the inner circle and that well known at the moment. So there will be this period of considerable risk until they can start, building up the personal equity of whoever takes over. So yeah, withdrawing troops, there will be considerable chaos as well. You remember Putin's often quoted statement when he was in Dresden. He was expecting instructions from Moscow and he got nothing. And that's when he felt the collapse of empire. But the collapse of empire manifests in a whole variety of ways. I visited Vorkuta in 1998, it was. And there you could feel what the other aspect of withdrawal, not just of empire, but of central control, central largesse. People weren't paid on time. They're working down mines for 12 hours a day and they're getting paid in green cabbages. Well, you're likely to see that kind of stuff returning, move to a barter economy, because if Putin carries on for another 6, 9, 12 months, every resource, every monetary, physical resource Russia possesses is going to be channeled towards the military, which means, you said earlier, collapse in the property industries, collapse in the aviation industry. Various industries are going to go to the wall and there's going to be nothing to save them, because whatever is left is still going to be channeled towards the military industrial complex and probably one of the largest, most powerful mafia oligarchs is Chemizov, who controls around 80% of Rostec. Are meat production facilities going to win out over him? Is Nabula eventually going to win against him? No, the answer, of course, is no. So one by one, I think we're going to see all the vestiges of liberal market economics disappear. Everything is going to be thrown into the furnace of Putin's war. The question is, will that crumble before the Western will to support Ukraine crumbles? And I think this war has always been about not who is victorious, but who crumbles last. And unfortunately, we're seeing that play out in a very painful way at the moment.
That makes perfect sense. But looking ahead, what do you think is going to happen, Axel?
Yeah, when you said crumble and painful, I understand this. Of course, this war is painful, and Ukraine will have to take a few losses. But it's a war. It's a full-blown war. They are still standing on Ukrainian soil, and they're standing reasonably well in a number of areas along the line of contact. Operationally, they have enough small arms ammunition to replenish their troops still. It's not perfect, but they have it. They have more artillery ammunition now than they had, for example, last year at the same time. And they have a bit of striking capacity with missiles, which has worked reasonably well.
I'm not sure we have necessarily solved what's going on, but I think what we've highlighted is that we're going to continue to see dominoes falling. We're going to see instability in Russia's geopolitical ambitions, because ambitions are infinite, but resources are not. No matter how many Vatniks will say that they are, Russia is not infinite in resources, manpower, and its ability to project force around the world. And if other authoritarian regimes that are part of that network themselves come under pressure and their proxies come under pressure, then we could see part of this business empire, this autocratic business network, start to unravel. So I think what you've highlighted, Jason, is that the economic war, in some ways, at this point, is perhaps even more important than the battlefield war. As long as Ukraine is sustained with enough ammunition and enough support, that actually we need to intensify the economic war in order to have anything that resembles a win.
Absolutely. Big times ahead. So it's something to look forward to as Russia hopefully collapses.
Gentlemen, thank you.
Good seeing you guys. Take care.
Good to see you.